Thank you. And thank you for having us out under this very delicate and unfortunate situation. Let's go back to the body of water that Zahava alluded to. In the Bible, in the Chumash, the first international trauma took place at the Red Sea, the Yam Suf. And the Torah delineates in verse after verse, on the one hand, the relief of the fleeing nation as their enemy ceased to pursue them. But yet, in contrast, the Torah devotes picturesque verse after verse in talking about the horror and the trauma and the terror of all of the nations who saw this cataclysmic, tragic event. There's a verse in the Oz Yashir, which is familiar to all of us. The Torah says, Tipol alehem e masa v'fachad. There fell upon all who knew about this tragedy a masa, fear, and pachad, and terror. And there's a midrash which explores the difference between ema and also why it's written emata, not ema, and pachad, which is a more familiar term to us. Rashi brings a version of this midrash in his commentary. But the midrash says that the difference between emasa and pachad is that pachad affects the krovim, the people who are close to the tragedy. And their response, the way they respond internally to trauma, is through pachad, is through visceral terror. It's emotion. It's petrified. And that's pachad. And the Midrash says that the ema, that not quite synonym word for pachad, the ema affects the rechokim. It affects those people who are at a distance, the people who learn about the tragedy secondhand or thirdhand, what we call in science the ripple effect. The people who eventually learn about somebody else's horrible plight. And what besets them is not pachad, is not terror, but is ema. And the Medrash says that the reason that the word ema is written emata, not ema, is that it's a play on words. This is something that only the darshanim could get away with. But emata, emasa, means emas ka, the thought about why is God doing this. And the people who witness a trauma, who are there in the thick of it, who are related, who are survivors, who are secondary victims, the Medrash says, based on the verse in the Chumash, their response is going to be something profound and emotional. They're terrified, and that's how they respond to trauma. And the people who are at a distance, they're going to ratchet it up to a different level, to a cognitive level. They're going to wonder about it. They're going to ask why. They're going to think, what is God up to? In the events that befell Brooklyn Jewry, and New York Jewry, and East Coast Jewry, and National Jewry, and International Jewry last week, we know that we are all krovim. We're not distanced from this. We're not just dealing with ripple effect. We're not just handling this at an intellectual level and asking questions about why and how could it happen. But we are Jews, we are brethren or brothers and sisters, whether we are blood relatives or not to this family and to this child. But we are all Karovim. We all feel it. And that's part of our process. And we feel it at different levels. For some of us, depending on age and depending on other variables, for some of us, the initial response is one of horror. And for some of us, the initial reflex is to look for our own children or our grandchildren and embrace them and to hold them close. And for others, the response is one of anger and even one of rage, looking for someone or something to blame. And of course, there are those of us who don't initially feel the impact of trauma at a core level, but rather we ponder it, we contemplate, we do distance ourselves from the event. We read about it, we talk about it, and we begin to riddle ourselves with spiritual questions, with theological quandary. But each of us, again, depending on age, depending on affiliation, depending on what the event means to us, depending on how we became engaged, what we were doing when we first heard about it, what steps we took to try intervening or trying to do something purposeful. Each of us is going to respond to trauma in a different manner. And the focus of our talks this evening are going to be looking at our responses, how to cope, and some constructive ideas. So much of the time when the Jewish community or a family or a nation or a neighborhood are affected by tragic, sudden, inexplicable, painful loss of the caliber of last week's event, so much of the time our mind turns to questions of why, which is philosophical, which is looking for an explanation. And as one of the speakers who spoke briefly before I came here mentioned, that it's going to take a long, long while. I think it was the Rabbi Weinberger who said that perhaps ba'achar b'sayamim, in times to come, we'll have an explanation that may not be soothing, but will put things in perspective. But it's interesting that throughout all of Chumash, and throughout all of Tanakh, and throughout both of the Talmudim, and throughout almost all of the Midrashim, we never find that the Torah response, or the responses that the Torah recommends for us in reacting to trauma, is to dwell on why. Shortly, we'll be reading Megillat Eicha. And take a look at the word Eicha. The Megillah, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, doesn't start off by saying Lama, Madua. But the word Eicha, it can't really be translated, why did this happen? But Eicha is more a combination of, what does this mean? What happens next? And this is, for the time being, the way that the Jewish community can mobilize itself in dealing with our tragedy and in dealing with the shock waves that go through our families and our children. Our question is, what does this indicate? How does this guide us? How do we move ahead? A lot of the people who spoke in the press and in the media, in the Jewish media, after the tragic murder of this child, they made an association to the Parsha to the Torah passage of Egla Arufa. And you may remember that in the case of the murder victim, that the Torah prescribes for us and for the community a protocol of steps to follow. And many of the people speaking in the media, they focused on the plea that the elders of the community assert that our hands didn't spill this blood. It wasn't our fault. I'm not going to dwell on the issue of fault. It's not helpful and it's not healthy. But I do want to take you into the Parsha of Egla Arufa and share a meaningful idea. Again, the Torah prescribes for us an entire procedure for dealing with senseless murder. And Rabbeinu Asher, who was a great Rishon, a medieval Rishon, in the generation after Rashi and after the Rambam, he has a take on the Parsha of Egla Arufa. And he says this whole process of trying to identify who the victim was and trying to figure out what town he came from and trying to select some type of atonement process and trying to designate a certain area where this atonement can take place. He says the function of all of those arduous steps where the entire community, the entire town gets engaged in sacrificial process and in judicial process and in the psychological processes. So Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, says that the Torah's wisdom here is that rather than let people be stunned into silence, and rather than people remaining paralyzed, not knowing what to do, and eventually becoming self-absorbed and withdrawing emotionally, the Torah is pushing us and prompting us to mobilize, to take action, to do something, to do a variety of different things, but to focus on what happened and to move on in a way that's both preventative and that's cathartic and that is atoning also. And we are all relatives to Leiby. Our job is to be moved and to let our children be moved, to validate when our children cry, or our children tremble, or our children ask questions about safety. Our first task is to validate that you're hurting, and this is frightening, and this is scary, and this did happen. And beyond validating with our children and with ourselves that it hurts and that it was a reality, we do need psychologically for our mental health and for our spiritual healthiness, we do need to identify the fact that we feel, that we hurt, that it's in our thoughts and it's in our hearts, and it's not fear alone and it's not anger alone, but it's helplessness. And it's searching for ways to assure, to promise ourselves and our descendants that this can't happen again, that we're going to do the healthy things, the important things, we're going to have solidarity, we're going to have safety, so that we can try to assure our children that they are safe and that they can be protected. Beyond the validation, beyond the recognition that the feelings are there and that we hurt and that there's a family without a child, there is also the importance, going back to Rabbeinu Asher, going back to the Rosh, to take steps like you're doing this evening, to come together, to ask questions, not to let this event evaporate from consciousness. The steps that we need to take, many of which my wife will be speaking about, in terms of constructing systems for child safety in the community. These are steps that we can take tonight. And these are steps that with the help of law enforcement and with the city township government and with the help of Lifeline and its gifted staff, that we can implement prevention and intervention steps now. But in dealing with our trauma, in dealing with our pain, what are some important steps? Let's call them evidence or research-based steps. What can a community do? What can families do to regroup after this trauma? I would recommend that we look at how preoccupied we are with ourselves to the degree that our children grow up in spite of us. The time that we spend on the phone, the time that we spend at work, the time that we spend on the computer doing important things. We all have a reason to keep busy nowadays. But to recognize that our children grow up in spite of us. And it's important to regroup. It's important to call your children in, to embrace them, to reassure them that you're an invested parent and that you want to be taking an active role in their psychological life as well as in the life they lead as students. Embrace your children. Take time for them. Take time with them. Something else, and again, just looking at research on recovery from trauma, listen to your children. Listen to their questions. Get to know their world. Get to know the stresses that they face and the challenges and the confusion that they're confronted with. As someone said earlier, this is our 9/11. The world has changed. In Lifeline and Project High, unfortunately, we deal with events that are tragic and that are traumatic too much of the time, not just on the East Coast, not just the United States, but we are consulting sometimes round the clock. We're flying places, we're speaking, we're intervening. This is a different world that we're in. There are more dangers that our children and that we face. Listen to your children. Get to know their world from their perspective. Guide your children. Whether it's dealing with strangers, whether it's dealing with opportunities that seem suspicious to you, give them guidance. There was a school of thought in the psychology of moral development back in the 70s that said it's not a parent's job to give or to impose guidance on children. Children have to discover what works for them. Children have to discover their own limits. Children have to be given the creativity to go beyond family limits and find out their own morality. And all of that research began to decay and to crumble as even the gifted researchers behind it ended up rethinking when they looked at the decadence and they looked at the collapse of the family and its values. Guide your children. Take an active role in what they do. Teach them what's important in life. And teach them what to keep away from. The definition of a trauma is an event for which the mind has no precedent. You've never been through it before. You can't quite compare it to something that you know that's familiar to you. And when a person is confronted with trauma, it's like a pinball machine. It goes on tilt if there's too much pressure. And the mind isn't sure, what reference point do I have in my heart or in my soul to deal with this or to make sense of this? And this is a trauma. We don't have a precedent for this in the Jewish community. This isn't something that we've dealt with in the past. The murder of a young Jewish child at the hands of a Jewish person. This is a trauma for which all of us are on tilt. Again, some of us through our theological questions, some of us through the tearing of the heart and the tearing of the eye. Each of us is responding in a different way, and during the Q&A session, we will try to field questions about different ages and how to address your children's reaction. But we face trauma not with the question of why, but with the question of what do we do now? We struggle at an individual level with what does this mean, but as a community, we go beyond meaning and we look, what is the purpose we now have to tackle as a community? And with Hashem's help and with our own solidarity, we will find consolation in time, answers in the future, and let's mobilize the energy that's brought you all here tonight to make a difference for our generation.